CSS is the pizza to the HTML party. It's always more fun when there's pizza. Get it? No one? All right. Fine. I was going to order pizza for everybody. But no, I'm just joking. Not about that life.
Yeah.
Bye.
Go get him.
Get him, tiger. All right. Are we recording? John? Oh, I didn't know we were recording. Wonderful. Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about CSS. Now we're going to talk about CSS. Okay, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. Cascading. Okay, so CSS, the things it is and the things it is not. It's really small print. This is really good feedback for myself. So CSS is a style sheet language. It's used to describe the presentation of an HTML document. So it's solely about the presentation of that document, okay? The rules that are set up will style both the content inside that element and the element itself, okay? So CSS will help you style the content that lives inside of an HTML element and the way that that element performs itself, so, right?
CSS is like toolbar font size, color,
yeah,
bold,
good parallel to that. Yes, pretty much. So yeah, so
I do what I can.
thank you for that visual. That was like really useful. There will be a star board after this presentation. Okay, so things that are important to know about CSS. CSS selectors, so we started talking a little bit about like class and ID and all that stuff. The way we interact with that on the CSS side is called selectors, okay? So it's basically like how you ask for stuff on HTML. It's called a selector. It's going to be integral to dealing with JavaScript and HTML. So like just that's a word you're going to use all the time, selectors, okay? What CSS is not. CSS is not just for making HTML pretty, okay? CSS helps make the web accessible. CSS helps enhance usability, okay? CSS also has like really cool animation features and does some mathematical stuff as well, okay? CSS is pretty awesome. Okay, CSS is not easy. Okay, I know some people might think like, oh, you know CSS, like that's kindergarten stuff. Actually, no, CSS is really complicated. There's ways of making it, you know, useful, but it does take discipline, and it does have a level of scope that you would need to make sure that you're employing in order to get the job done the way you need it to be done, okay? So it's not easy. It's not an easy thing. Alternatively, it's not hard. So people usually look at CSS and they're like, I don't even know what's happening. I'm sure in the coming weeks we'll send out GIFs of like how people feel about CSS. It's like, it can be the most frustrating thing ever. But a lot of it comes from, again, going back to like understanding scope, understanding the way it's utilized, and then like, are there other root causes around like the way that you structured your HTML that's just not setting up the way that it should be going, or there's too many kitchens, there's too many chefs in the kitchen when it comes to like a user agent style sheet versus my style sheet versus the library I'm using style sheet, okay? But when you adhere to rules and the way that CSS should be set up, you can use just a few lines of CSS with your HTML, and things look really spiffy and organized and usable, and everybody's happy until you find a browser that doesn't work with the CSS you just wrote. So that's kind of like in a nutshell where CSS is coming from. Okay. So again, with the languages, right? We talked about all these different types of languages, and CSS is a scripting, or not scripting, it's a style sheet language. Okay. So what CSS looks like. This I took from the Mozilla Developers Network. When we're dealing with front-end stuff, Mozilla has been kind of on the forefront of everything, you know, including HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You know, obviously they were like, Mozilla has been doing all the things when it comes to the web. So they kind of really pride themselves in that, and their Mozilla Developer Network resource is really, really just full of really clear documentation, guides, you know, challenges for you to take, all this kind of stuff. So I would really bookmark Mozilla Developer Network, but I took this from there. Mozilla Firefox.
So,
Where does their revenue stream come from? Yeah, Mozilla. I mean, because like they've been known as kind of like the open source, you know, web browser. But where do they get the money to do all these like sites that document everything? Like, I mean, if they put up so much documentation on the web, and as you point out, they've been leading that.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the
yes. You have $275 million. $275 million for Firefox in 2015.
But that's how much they made. That was the revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You sell ads.
So yeah, so they're making a lot of money from Firefox, but I would say additionally, documentation, although it should, does not take money, right? Open source is a bunch of people like really passionate and you know, taking on the role of being experts in this field, and Mozilla takes that seriously, and they're reflecting that in their branding and in the way that they continue to allow people to contribute documentation. So again, it's open source, so people have the ability to contribute to this documentation, just like Rails guides, just like any other guide that we've been utilizing so far. But theirs is pretty on point when it comes to front end stuff.
So you have a pretty supportive positive outlook on Mozilla. Like, so they're direct competitors with Google Chrome.
Now, that's because Google was like, oh, we should get in the browser game.
Google Chrome.
Right.
The functionality is not even the same. Really good. Google's got a lot more flexible functions.
It's probably their fight for developers, right? Like, see, they have a lot of the same developer sites, right? Where you can go in and work on tools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas Internet Explorer was kind of just like a thing.
Yes.
Now they're like fighting
Not
for
necessarily Mozilla is
Oh.
Yeah,
interesting.
they're also a foundation. So Mozilla has their wing in there. They have a lot of different areas of work. So I heart Mozilla and Chrome. So we can talk about this for hours at another point in time. And when Chris comes back, I'm sure he has a lot of feelings about this as well. Yeah, Mozilla Web Foundation is amazing. They also, anyway, there's a lot of things about Mozilla. But my point is that I took this documentation about CSS from Mozilla Web Foundation, from Mozilla's Developer Network, which you should also check out, okay? So this is the basic syntax for a CSS line of code, okay? You have a selector list. You'll understand why it's a list, but for now you would put a given selector. So like, for example, we would put P for paragraph or class students, okay? And then inside of that, we say, I want to set this property for this element to this value, okay? So, and then you can set like multiple property value pairs inside of that curly brace, instructing the browser to do these things to this element.
Properties like font, values like 10.
Yes, yes. Example, okay? So yeah, so just to throw an example, just like you said, right? So I said I want P, and I want color to be blue, and I want font size to be 40 pixels. I don't care. Going out, right? Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about pixels soon. But this is a value that's 40 like actual pixels on the screen size for the font. Okay, take up 40 pixel size spaces. So if I run, so right now I put this in a style. So just like you have index.html, you have style.css is pretty standard for what the CSS document should be named. Once we get into like larger systems, you might have one given page name and then one page name.css corresponding to that page or that object, or whenever we start dealing with React. Okay. But for now, we have one index page, one style page, and then those are going to talk to each other to render something to the browser. Question?
What if you have more than one? So you do have more than one paragraph. How does it know which paragraph you're referring to?
Good question. Right now, it does not. It's saying select every paragraph and apply these styles. So selector here means select everything I say right here and apply the following styles. Okay, so if I showed you this browser, if I show you this website in the browser, those are my two paragraphs, right? So they applied that information to both paragraphs. Okay, but if I wanted only the first one, we can talk about how to do that. I feel like it's probably like first child or something like that. I can do it like that, or I can specify on the HTML side. I can, maybe not 1, 2, 3, 4. I might want to do something like paragraph, you know, ID intro, right? And then on this side, so this is what I'm probably going to talk about this in my presentation. Hold on, we're like getting a little far. Let me. Yeah, it does. I think so. We've talked a little bit about these words already. We'll probably circle back to some of these words. But so far we've heard selector, property, value, right? Specificity is alluding to the question that you asked. How do I specifically select this one paragraph out of all the paragraphs, right? We'll talk about pseudo later, okay? So cascading means that the styles will apply cascading through the flow of the HTML document from top to bottom, okay? And then from there, there's 4 things that will factor into the styles that will end up being applied, okay? The first of which is importance. Importance means there's like 3 chefs in the kitchen at any given time, okay? There's the author, which right now is me, the person who wrote this CSS for this particular page, okay? There is a user, so if we're looking at this, so if like Taylor's looking at this on his computer, he might have a certain set of styles that he set up on his browser to like only show like the browser, like all the dark colors of the browser, or like whatever, certain settings, like I want my font to be like super huge, or I want it to be super tiny, okay? So that is a given user's settings, okay? And then the last one is the default user's agent style sheet. So remember when we went from paragraph to H1 and it got all big and bold and we were like, how did it do that? The browser itself has a set of default styles that it will apply to any given HTML element that it knows about, to just give an idea of like, oh, I should expect that when an anchor tag is put on the screen, it should be blue and underlined and hoverable. And when I hover over it, it should change color. Okay, those are a set of default styles that are set up by the browser, okay, to apply.
Our own profiles and set up our CSS settings.
So
As
what we're going to do is we're going to be authors of CSS. We're going to be aware that any given user who looks at our CSS, yeah. So any given user who looks at our web page might or might not have their own settings that will shift the way that our page is viewed. And whatever browser they're using might have some default setup for how it's going to be rendered. Okay, so the most important thing is what you write. Okay, that's what's going to be applied most importantly. Okay, but if there's nothing, right? If I didn't write anything, it defaults to the user, and then if they didn't write anything, it defaults to the user agent. Make sense? Okay, so after that, source order comes into play. So on this side, we wrote that we have one link for one style, okay? If something happened to where I also had, wait, I want this to be down here. So if I had another, page of CSS styling and I put this at the bottom, okay, these styles go first, these styles go second, okay? So in a cascading order, that means that these styles are gonna get applied last. So if I do anything that overwrites what's happening in this style.css, in my other style.css, it'll overwrite what happened previously.
Is it preferred to have multiple CSS files or lump it all in the same file with IDs?
Good question. It depends on how big your system is and how repetitive your CSS might be. So if you have stuff that's like particular to a page, but you have like 20 pages and you have like a larger standing CSS that's like overarching the entire 10 pages, you might use that as like the first line of CSS, and then you have like another like just for this page CSS under that says like, okay, now that all that stuff, the page itself has been set up the way every other page should be, I have this particular set of information for this particular page in a separate CSS document. Okay, and you would want to order it appropriately. Okay?
So if you want to use a style CSS, you have to include that in the you use, or you can just put that in.
So right now, when you're using just one HTML page and just one style, like, yeah, you would need to apply it. You would need to link to every single page. There are frameworks and the ways that we're going to be utilizing our application that will do some of that work for us so that we don't have to be repetitive for every page, putting the same stuff on the same page. But as we're learning, you always link to the one CSS document that you're going to use. Okay. I'll talk about, there's 3 ways that you're going to use CS, that you have the capability of using CSS. For right now, this is the way you should know how to use it. Okay. Okay, so getting back to your question about specificity, or like how do I pinpoint just the one paragraph? Okay. When you write your selector list, you have the ability to write a set of selectors that will further specify like the pinpoint element that you want to apply styles to. So for this line of selectors, you're saying the ID nav, so there's only one nav on a page, where there's a selected class on that element, and then, oh, I can't remember if this is inherited or, I'll talk about this specific caret right now because I can't remember off the top of my head. But then you have this A, so like the A tag where somebody is hovering over it, you're saying like this specific, in this specific condition, do these styles. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and this is what's called a pseudo a pseudo element or a pseudo class.
And sorry, the hashtag nav. What is you said it's on one page? What is that?
So hashtag nav means that it's an ID. So it's an element with the ID of nav,
Oh, okay.
and you specify that in CSS using a hashtag. Okay, and then for dot selected, a dot indicates that this is a class. So hashtag is for ID, and dot is for class. What do y'all think? What do you think is more specific? In this case or in general?
The ID, the nav.
Yeah.
Has to be a bunch of things.
The
right?
the ID is going to be more specific than a class.
So you just have, is this like just helping the system pinpoint which class and then focus down on the ID?
So then you would say in the ID nav element, there might be a whole bunch of different elements in there.
Oh.
I want to choose the one element with the class selected on it. And then I want to go in there and look for the anchor tag element that has the pseudo class of hover state on it, basically. And then I will change the CSS from that. So specificity comes into play when it comes to when styles are going to be applied. You can be that specific.
The second one, where you don't have the caret on there between UL and OI,
Mm-hmm.
is that, so we need the caret between a class and an element, but you don't need between an element and an element?
No, the caret is not specifically around like a class and an element. It's about the relationship of these pieces to these pieces. So this might be like the A tag inside of the selected class. That's what this caret is specifying. I could be wrong right now off the top of my head, but I'm going to talk about this in a few slides from here. So that way we can more definitively reference that. Okay, the last thing is inheritance. Some elements have a set of properties on it, and then any element inside of that is going to have to deal with the outside elements specificity. So for example, if I have a nav bar that I only want to be like a 50% width of the page, okay? So then I want something inside of that to take up 50% of the page. I actually have to give it 100% width because it needs to take up the same width that the nav does. Does that make sense? Like it's inheriting the width of the parent element. So if I gave it also 50%, it would end up being 25% of the width, right? Because it's already inside an element that's taking up 50% of the page. So just keeping in mind where your elements are and what styles are being applied to the parent elements are going to help or hinder you from doing a successful job at CSS. Okay. Oh, wait. Okay, so this is how that happens. Okay, so right now we have shown this external way of using CSS. Okay, there are two other ways to apply CSS to HTML. They're not utilized very much and should not really be the way that you do them, but know that you can do them. Okay, the first one is an inline style. An HTML tag can have a style attribute on it directly. And you can set, hey, I want this particular paragraph. So if, for example, we took this information here, so a paragraph with a style where the color is red and the font style is bold, right? So if we put that here, so here, style, font, wait, I put font, style, bold, and you would write it with the same like CSS. It has to have like key and value and then semicolon per statement. You can write it directly in the HTML. So, okay. So right here, I'm saying this particular paragraph, I want it to have a bold font style and I want the color to be red. Okay, and then maybe I have font size to be like 20 px because we had the other one at 40, right? So if I go to this page, by going to the page like this, I guess, in the browser. Okay, so I set that style specifically onto the paragraph tag, even though the corresponding style sheet says I want every paragraph to be have a blue font and be 40 pixels. I said, no, don't listen to the style sheet HTML paragraph tag. I want you to specifically do this. Okay, so it overwrote the styling that the external style sheet gave it. Okay, imagine if I had to do that to every 20 corresponding paragraphs that I had to write. Like, that's really annoying. What if I wanted to have like 20 different styles happen on that one paragraph? That tends to be really, really, really like too much, right? Don't repeat yourself. So that's why inline styles are less and less used, okay?
But if you were gonna do what we just did, like pinpointing, right? Like hashtag tab and all that stuff, it's almost, those are almost the same, either writing inline or heading. Right?
So yeah, sometimes if you have like a super specific, like it's like super important that this style comes up this way, you might write it inline. But the other things that are happening on that document, maybe like JavaScript or other things that are going on, could change this paragraph in ways that, like, maybe your hover status, for example, is like you want it to be dynamic, so you can't just like set it on there. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, inline. The next way of doing it is embedded. So you can have a style element in your HTML separately from your other HTML elements, and then just like your script tag, between the style tags, you would write all of your styling. Okay, that's another way of doing it. So I don't have two files. I have one file where here's all my HTML, and then on the style side, here's like my style element that I'm going to put all my CSS in. Okay, it's another way people write CSS onto HTML. And then the last one is external. Like, I'm just separating all my stuff. I have my HTML on one side and my CSS on the other side. That's it. They talk to each other through a link. Okay? And that's largely how you're going to do that. And again, it lives in the head section of your HTML document, the link, okay? And the link order is going to be important. Okay. So you would want to just make sure that you know that the order is going to you're basically putting one document here and the next document here. So if there's anything down in the second document that overrides the first and you don't want that to happen, that you would want to switch it. But that order is going to be important. Okay, so now let's talk about selectors. No, I want to talk about selectors. Okay, so this is where that stuff comes into play. So the first one we have, the first type of selector we have is a element type. So that's what we used in the first place with P, right? All paragraph elements do this thing, okay? The second one we have is what's called a pseudo element. So you mentioned, what if I only want to get the first paragraph, right? So a pseudo element means that I can use my understanding of HTML as being like a node tree. So I can call particular types of pseudo elements to ask for like the first child in a thing, in a tree, or the first of something or the last of something. Okay, there are a set of pseudo element types that I can refer to in my CSS. Maybe I don't know how many things there might be in my list, but I know the last list item needs to have a border at the bottom, so I know that like it looks nice, right? So regardless of how many things end up in that list eventually, that style will apply appropriately. The third one is a class name. So again, we talked about class being indicated by a dot. Okay, so dot class name is going to say every element, regardless of the type, that has the class name student. So maybe I'm an anchor tag, and John is a paragraph tag, and Taylor is a, what kind of tag do you want to be? Section tag, and Alex is a, what tag are you? H1 tag, right? But we're all under the class student, okay? So if I wanted to select all of us, I would do dot students, apply these styles. Make sense? The next one is a pseudo class. So the first one, pseudo element, has 2 colons, okay? A pseudo class has 1 colon. And this is more like a state of being. So you might see stuff like anchor tag visited, anchor tag hovered, anchor tag active, anchor. So you'll see a few of that coming into play. So if you only wanted to change a link that has been visited to purple, that's how that's happening, okay? So it's a particular state that this element is in.
And that's within that particular session.
Usually with the particular session, but like whether it's been visited or not, like this is a good question of like how it determines that might be about session storage. Yeah, there might be there's code in the background probably from session storage web API that's saying like, these are the links in this document that have been visited. So then it gives it the status of visited. But that's how that stuff gets changed stylistically, okay? Then the last, not the last one, second to last one is hashtag, which again is ID name or ID, okay? So hashtag indicates that this is an ID. And then I can style anything with that one ID. And then the last one is attribute. So any anchor tags with the attribute of this, like target equals blank, which means that it goes to, like the target will go to a blank page, like it goes to a new page, as opposed to opening that anchor tag in the same window, okay? So if I want to have that specific kind of style or selector, then I can do it by an attribute. So anything where there's something required, for example, maybe if it's a required element or there's a required attribute on it, I can like put a red border around it so people know this is a required field, for example, for form elements. Okay, that's how you would indicate that in selectors for your CSS to be applied. Okay, so we were talking about the combinators. So that caret is like, yeah, child, so parent A, child B. Okay, so it's like the child element inside this other class or whatever element do things to these children. Okay, and then descendant is formatted in that way.
Everything within that child.
Yeah. Well, it could be, yeah, like whatever, if B is a class, or if B is a tag element, that's what you would be indicating here.
What's the difference between the child and the descendant? Aren't child's descendant of a parent? That seems confusing.
That is a good question.
If you descend is further than child, and use child, subchild.
It's the grandchildren.
Yeah, I will double check that. Child might be direct, where descendant might be like nested further, like everything under it,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
But child might be like one line under. And then general sibling is, you know, like if I'm right next to you, or adjacent sibling. Oh, adjacent sibling is if I'm right next to you, whereas general sibling is like if I'm in the same vicinity or yeah, the same larger block. I don't. That's how that would work. Okay, so
that'd be
these
like
are
you're trying to style certain sections or something instead of like everything that's that class.
Yeah.
You can, like, put it in groups and-
yeah. So these are like some ways that comes into play, and we kind of saw that earlier with the like super specificity, right? That's how you might see that come into play. All right, now let's talk about properties. So properties are the things you put inside those curly braces, right? So the styles you actually want to apply to any given selected set of elements. Some most popular ones are going to be like around the color or like the background. So I put dashes here because there are sets of things, like there's background color, background image, background URL, or background like background repeat or not. So there's like specific things you can do with the larger set of background or font. We said we used font size, we used font weight. Okay, actually I don't know why they're not. There we go. There's some of them. So text and border also have those kinds of like extra sections that you can specify things with. Some other cool properties that I think are interesting are transition, animation, opacity, transform. So you can do a lot of really cool interactive things, which is just CSS, and z-index, which deals with like positioning. Like I want you to stay in this specific spot right here, like z-index math stuff. You start dealing with like playing with games or doing stuff with games, or dealing with sprites, for example, like some of that stuff starts coming into play that CSS can do. Oh, yeah, I put some of these look familiar. Does anybody notice any of these? Padding, border, margin, right? Property shorthands. So I mentioned background has a few extra things that you can write. So if I wanted to write like this example here, call to action has background. Does anybody know what this hashtag 000 is? It's a hex code.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I wanted to do background, like, let's see, I want to do background color, image, repeat, and position, right? So if I wanted to write that out, to action. Okay, and I said I wanted to do background. See how they're all there? Size, origin, color, clip, position, attachment, repeat, image. Okay, there's a whole bunch. So I can say background, size, image, and then background, color, this stuff, background, position, you know. So
this isn't Sublime material, right?
I am in Sublime, yes. Background, background repeat. Okay, so I can set up all this information. It looks like I'm repeating myself a little bit, right? Because I'm using background this, right? So there are a certain set of CSS properties that you can shorthand. So I'm showing you a list of the shorthands. So instead of me writing all of these with the value, I can just write background. Background is the key, and then these are all the values. It just understands that like this is the color, this is the image, this is the repeat part, this is the like origin. Okay, so a good good practice is for you to write them all out first. Understand what they all are, and then know that you can write this shorthand. Okay, one that you're going to see very quickly and very often is using the one for margin and padding. Okay, margin and padding go along a box, just like we've already talked about, right? And it goes from top to the right to the bottom to the left. So everything, when you're used like clockwise, I guess, right? So when you're applying styles, it's going to apply those styles clockwise from the top of that box around clockwise. So this in itself is a shorthand, because here I'm saying padding by itself instead of saying, so what was this, like hot dog? Whew. Okay, so I can say padding top, padding, oh, not padding, padding. Yeah, padding right. It doesn't like it because I don't have the thing. So instead of me writing 20px, padding, oops, bottom, and then padding left. Instead of me repeating myself doing that, I can just say padding 20px. That is the equivalent. Because it knows that if all I'm saying is padding, that I should expect that on all four sides, I'm going to have 20 pixels of padding from the top to the right to the bottom to the left. Okay, if I wanted to have 20 pixels top bottom and then maybe like 5 pixels left right, I can say 20 pixels, 5 pixels. Okay, so then I'm saying 20 top bottom, 5 left right. Make sense? Okay, so again, these are shorthands for having to write it all out. So that equivalent here would be like, this is 5, this is 5. Like, why repeat myself twice when I could just write it in one line? Okay, same thing going on with border and font. There's a set of border width, border style, border color that I can just write in one line. So you'll see this almost the most often, border. Border is a 6 pixel solid red. That makes sense as one sentence, right? I want my border to be this wide, this kind of style, and this kind of color.
So John showed us a website that had a lot of styling, but didn't seem like it didn't involve all this work. You know that library you're talking about? Yeah. About feature or shape or whatever.
Ooh, so that is written in CSS. So it's a library. So yeah, so when we're utilizing anything .js or anything CSS, right? Like that's a library somebody wrote that says when somebody uses hot dog, apply these stylings, okay? And then all you have to do is just like put something in your HTML that says ID of hot dog. And then all of a sudden you have like this cool web page. It's because they already wrote all the settings for what you should expect to happen when you use these terms. So yeah, we're gonna see how all that stuff, like you're gonna write it all over from scratch yourself, right? And you're gonna be like, oh, this sucks. I wish there was somebody else that just told me the right way to do it. And then tomorrow you'll see the better way. And then you'll realize that it's only better until you want to do it your way, right? So it's the better way until you want to do it your way. And then you learn like, this is the way that like I would like to throw my styles around. And then you use some of that information as like best practices. and then you know appropriately how to write CSS from scratch in a not so, like, it's not a horrible way. Like, it doesn't feel horrible to you because you like know how to do it. Just the same way that like building classes doesn't feel horrible to you in the way that it originally did, right? Because you, well, you know, eventually you're like, oh, you don't need an initialize, but sometimes you do. Like, you don't have to have these attributes, but sometimes you do. Like, it gets easier and easier once you have some, like, you have your, practice wheels, and then you take them off and you know how to do stuff, right? And you just get better and better at that craft. Okay, so let's see. There's some other pieces here, and I'm gone on an hour here. We have a lot of questions, but display types, I don't think at this very moment you need to know. We'll probably review this stuff when we get into like how you deal with like sorting the boxes you create with the elements around. That's where display comes into play. That going into like, now I understand that the box exists and this is how I interact with that box to make it do what I want and place it where I want. Okay, so I think we'll tackle this stuff a little later because I want you to get some lunchtime and to work on the challenges for today. Just like really getting used to messing with HTML and like applying styles with CSS, or just like learning about HTML elements and CSS styles and properties. So that's going to be your focus for today. And then we can deal with CSS layout and display a little later. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right, cool. No, I think part of this is going to like bleed into tomorrow. I really want y'all to jump in on the challenges that we have for today and see where you're at so that we can do more of this tomorrow. So the make a circle challenge, I have to like push up real quick, but it's like make a circle, like learn how to make a circle. And then top 10 is the next challenge that you're gonna do. It's really just allowing you to utilize HTML reference and CSS reference to learn about all the different things you have available to you. Choose like 5 or 10 elements that you're intrigued about and like learn about them and then present what they are in an HTML page. That's what you're gonna do here. And then the other one is LinkedIn HTML. And that is a challenge where you're basically going to wireframe and try to emulate what a LinkedIn profile page should look like. And I have examples that I used from mine for you to look at. But like you'll end up with something that looks somewhat like this. Yeah, super 1.0, like no styles applied, just HTML. I want you to be able to write out what would it look like if I had to write HTML for a LinkedIn page. Okay, so don't expect it to look like LinkedIn, just expect you should have sections and like appropriate areas for content to get used to that. And then you'll deal with LinkedIn CSS next, and then LinkedIn JavaScript next. Okay. There's also styling. What is it? Recreating Hacker News, which is another challenge that you can get into.
Basic Y Combinator.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like really basic looking, right? The orange and yellow.
It looks basic, but it might be a little more difficult than you immediately feel like.
Yeah, but not the interactivity.
Sure, you're just building the
Like HTML.
the HTML, yeah, and some of the CSS. Like you're trying to apply styles so that it's close enough to Hacker News. But this is again like the last challenge you would do. So try and build a circle first, right? That'll help.